No, please don't leave me!
The dungeon door slammed shut,
shut it!
and for the first time, in her 22 years of life, Princess Séraphine Auclaire, daughter of King Aldrich Beaumont, of the House of Norrevane, heard a sound she had never once heard directed at her a lock. Her silk gown was torn at the shoulder, her wrists were bound in iron, and standing just beyond the rusted bars, watching her sink to her knees on the cold stone floor, was the one man she had trusted above all others. Lord Cassien Thibaudeau, her father's most decorated general, her childhood confidant, the man whose eyes had once looked at her like she was worth protecting, said nothing. He simply turned and walked away. "Cassien," she whispered, her voice breaking against the dark. "You know I didn't do this." But the torchlight swallowed him whole, and the corridor went silent. They said she poisoned the king. They said the evidence was undeniable. They said a princess had finally shown her true colors. But here is what no one is asking. Who placed the vial in her chambers? And why does the one witness refuse to speak? Was Séraphine truly guilty? Or was she the most perfectly framed woman in the kingdom of Norrevane? And what secret is Cassien Thibaudeau carrying that he would rather let an innocent woman rot in a dungeon than reveal? If you are already gripping the edge of your seat, you are exactly where this story needs you to be. Because what happens next will shatter everything you think you know about loyalty, power, and who in this kingdom truly has blood on their hands. Subscribe right now, and hit that notification bell because this story is only just beginning, and trust me, you cannot afford to miss a single part. It's fair, resubscribe, because Seraphine's truth is coming, and it will change everything. The cold was the first thing that reminded Séraphine she was still alive. It crept through the stone floor and climbed her bones the way winter climbs a bare tree, slow and certain, and without mercy. She had been sitting in the same position for what felt like hours, her back pressed against the dungeon wall, her bound wrists resting in her lap, like something already defeated. The silk of her gown, the pale gold one she had worn to her father's evening court, was stained now at the hem with dungeon filth, and the shoulder where a guard had grabbed her too roughly was beginning to bruise in a deep, ugly purple. She had not cried. She wanted to make that clear to herself, because in the hours since that door had locked behind her, the urge had risen and risen like floodwater behind a dam. But Séraphine Auclaire had spent 22 years watching her father's court and understanding, with a clarity that most women her age were never afforded, that tears in a room full of enemies were simply ammunition handed freely to the wrong people. So she breathed. She counted the stones in the wall across from her. She listened to the drip of water somewhere deep in the corridor, and she did not cry. What she did instead was think about Cassien. She could not stop thinking about Cassien. She had known him for most of her life. He had come to the House of Norrevane when she was 9 years old, and he was barely 16. A sharp-eyed boy from the Northern Territories, with a military bearing that seemed too large for his still-growing frame. Her father, King Aldrich Beaumont, had taken notice of him during a regional tournament and had brought him to court as a ward, a strategic decision dressed in the language of generosity, as most of her father's decisions were. Cassien had trained under the kingdom's finest generals and risen through the ranks with a speed that made older men uncomfortable and younger men desperate to follow him. By the time he was 25, he had been named Lord Commander of Norrevane's Western forces. By 28, he was the most decorated military figure in the kingdom's living memory. And through all of it, through all those years of watching him become the man the kingdom relied on, Séraphine had known something about Cassien Thibaudeau that none of his soldiers or admirers or rivals ever seemed to notice. He watched her. Not the way courtiers watched her, with that practiced calculating attention that was really just an assessment of how useful she might be to their ambitions. He watched her the way someone watches a fire they are not sure they should get close to. Like he was always aware of where she was in a room, always processing, always holding something back. When she spoke in court, his jaw tightened slightly. When other men laughed too loudly at things she said, something moved behind his eyes that he immediately extinguished. He had never once crossed a line, had never said anything that could not be said in full public view. But she had felt it for years, that invisible thread between them, taut and unacknowledged, and humming with everything neither of them had ever allowed themselves to speak aloud. And tonight, he had looked at her through iron bars and walked away. She pressed her head back against the stone and closed her eyes. They were saying she had poisoned her father. The accusation had come so quickly, so perfectly assembled, that even in the chaos of the moment she had recognized it for what it was. Someone had planned this. Someone who understood the court well enough to know exactly which threads to pull, exactly which fears to activate, exactly how to make a king look at his own daughter and see a traitor. The vial had been found in her chambers, small and dark-glassed, wrapped in a cloth that bore her personal embroidery seal. The king's physician had confirmed the substance inside matched what had been detected in the king's evening wine. 2 of her own handmaidens had been brought forward, pale and shaking, to confirm they had seen her near the wine service earlier in the evening. Séraphine had been standing in the great hall when the accusation was read aloud, and the room had gone so completely silent that she could hear the candles breathing. She had looked at her father. King Aldrich Beaumont was not a warm man. He had never been the kind of father who tucked children into bed or remembered the names of their favorite horses. He was a king first, a strategist second, and a father somewhere further down a list that also included falcon keeper and amateur historian. But he had respected her. She had always believed, in whatever quiet and private way such things are believed, that he had respected her mind and trusted her judgment, even when he never said so directly. But when their eyes had met across that silent hall, what she saw in his face was not a father searching for the truth. It was a king who had already decided. And that, more than the iron on her wrists or the dungeon floor, or even Cassien's retreating back, was what had broken something open inside her chest. Not grief exactly. Something older and colder than grief. The specific ache of discovering that a person you had built your sense of safety around was never quite the foundation you believed them to be. The dungeon corridor shifted. It was subtle, just a change in the quality of the silence. The kind of shift that a woman raised in a court full of political predators learns to register without knowing she is registering it. Séraphine opened her eyes. Footsteps. They were measured and deliberate, not the heavy, careless tread of a dungeon guard. These footsteps knew exactly where they were going, and had made a decision about it that was not easily reversed. She straightened against the wall, lifted her chin, and arranged her expression into something that cost her considerable effort. She would not look broken when anyone came through that corridor. She would simply not. The torchlight at the far end flickered, and then a figure came into view, and every carefully constructed wall she had just built inside herself cracked straight down the middle. Cassien. He stopped a few feet from the bars. He was still in his military dress from the evening court, the deep charcoal jacket with the Norrevane crest at the breast, the polished boots, the sword at his hip that was more ceremony than threat, in a place like this. His face, that face she had spent years learning to read in spite of himself, was doing something complicated. The jaw was set the way it always was when he was managing something he did not want to feel. His eyes moved over her, over the torn shoulder and the bound wrists and the ruined gown, and something in them flinched, quickly. Controlled, but she caught it. She always caught it. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. It was Séraphine who broke the silence, because she was done waiting for other people to determine the shape of her situation. "You came back," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. She was quietly grateful for that. Cassien's expression did not change. "I came to tell you that a formal inquiry has been called for morning." "That is not why you came." A muscle moved in his jaw. "Séraphine, you walked away." She said it simply, without accusation, which was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. "You stood there and looked at me and walked away. And then you came back. So whatever it is you came to say, say it. I am not going anywhere." She gestured slightly with her bound wrists at the cell around her, a tiny, precise movement that contained within it about 14 years of the particular humor she had, developed to survive a court that underestimated her. Something shifted in his face. It was brief, and it was almost immediately buried, but it was there. That same thing she had always seen and never been allowed to name. Something that lived in the space between duty and want and had, apparently, been building pressure for a very long time. "I know you didn't do it," he said quietly. The words landed in the dungeon air like a stone into still water. "Then why?" she said carefully. "Did you walk away?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down the corridor, to the left and to the right, checking, she realized, whether they were alone. When he looked back at her, something in his posture had changed. It was almost imperceptible, that loosening of the military precision, but she recognized it, because she had never seen it in him before. He looked for just a moment, like a man who had run out of road. "Because the person who framed you," he said, his voice dropping so low she had to lean forward against the bars to hear it, "knows things they should not know. About you. About your movements. About the court's trust in you. About me. Séraphine stared at him. What does that mean? He held her gaze, and the answer she needed was sitting right there in his eyes, fully formed, pressing against the inside of his careful control like something that had been locked up for a very long time. But before he could speak, a door at the far end of the corridor opened, and Cassien's expression closed, completely, in an instant. Like a room with every window shuttered against a storm. He straightened, his voice went flat and professional. The inquiry begins at dawn, Your Highness. I would advise you to rest, and then he walked away again. But this time, just before he turned the corner, he glanced back once. It was the smallest thing. It lasted less than a second, and it told her everything. Séraphine pressed her hand flat against the cold iron bar and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of where she was and what was coming, and what it meant that the one man in the kingdom who believed her was also, apparently, the one man in the kingdom who was most afraid of what the truth would cost him. She did not know yet what Cassien Thibaudeau was carrying. She did not know yet whose hand had moved against her, or why or how deep the conspiracy ran beneath the polished floors of Norrevane's court. But she knew one thing with a kind of certainty that does not require evidence. She was going to find out. And whoever had put her in this dungeon was going to wish, before this was over, that they had chosen someone with considerably less reason to fight back. Sleep did not come. Séraphine had known it would not, but she had tried anyway, folding herself against the least offensive corner of the dungeon cell and closing her eyes with the same disciplined intention she brought to everything. An hour passed, maybe two. The torches in the corridor burned lower. The dripping water somewhere in the dark kept its indifferent rhythm. And her mind, that relentless, carefully trained mind that had served her so well in every other circumstance of her life, refused to be quiet. It kept returning to the same place, not to the accusation, not to the vial or the handmaidens or the court's terrible silence, not even to her father's face, which she was not yet ready to examine too closely because she understood instinctively that grief of that particular shape required more privacy than a dungeon cell afforded. It kept returning to her mother. Queen Isolde Auclaire had died when Séraphine was 11 years old. Not dramatically, not in the way that court stories preferred, with grand last words and a room full of weeping nobles. She had simply grown quieter over the course of a winter. Then thinner. Then one morning she had not woken up. The physicians had called it a failure of the heart. Séraphine had stood at the funeral in a black dress that was slightly too large for her, because no one had thought to have it fitted properly. And she had watched her father receive condolences with the composed and courteous expression of a man managing an inconvenient administrative event. She had understood then, at 11 years old, that she was alone in a specific way that had nothing to do with the number of people in the room. Her mother had been the only person in the house of Norrevane who had spoken to Séraphine as though her thoughts were worth the air they occupied. Isolde had been a quiet woman, not timid but deliberate, the kind of person who chose her words the way a careful gardener chooses which things to plant and where. She had taught Séraphine to read political situations the way other mothers taught their daughters embroidery. She had sat with her in the library for hours and walked her through the history of every noble house in the kingdom and explained, in language plain enough for a child but rich enough for a future woman of court, exactly how power moved and where it hid and what it cost. She had also told her, once, in the particular tone she reserved for things she wanted remembered, that the most dangerous person in any room is never the one making the most noise. Séraphine pressed her bound wrists against her chest and stared at the dungeon ceiling. Someone in that court had been very, very quiet. She ran through the list the way her mother had taught her, methodically, without the distortion of personal feeling, though personal feeling kept pushing at the edges. Who had access to her chambers? Who understood her daily movements well enough to know when she would be near the wine service, and how to ensure witnesses saw her there? Who had the skill to replicate her embroidery seal on the cloth wrapping the vial, a detail so precise it could not have been improvised? And beneath all of those questions, the one she kept circling back to without meaning to. What did Cassien mean when he said they knew things about him? She had been trying not to pull at that thread too directly, because she was aware, with the self-honesty she had always forced herself to maintain, that her thoughts about Cassien Thibaudeau were not entirely objective. They had not been objective for some time. She was not sure exactly when it had shifted. when he had moved in her internal landscape from trusted figure to something she had no safe name for. But she remembered a specific moment about 2 years ago that she had never told anyone and never intended to. There had been a winter reception in the East Gallery. She had been standing near the far window, watching snow fall on the courtyard below, briefly alone in the way you can be briefly alone in a crowded room if you position yourself correctly. And Cassien had appeared beside her, without announcement, which was characteristic of him. That ability to move through space without disturbing it. They had stood in silence for a moment, which was also characteristic of them. That particular ease of not needing to fill every quiet between them. And then he had said, very quietly and without looking at her, "You are the most capable person in this room?" She had turned to look at him. He was still watching the courtyard. "That is a considerable statement," she had said. "There are decorated generals in this room." "I know," he had said. "I am one of them." And then someone had called his name from across the gallery and he had gone, and they had never spoken of it, and she had spent a frankly embarrassing amount of time afterward, examining those 12 words from every possible angle, like a jeweler assessing a stone she was not sure she could afford. The torchlight in the corridor shifted. She heard footsteps again and her whole body tensed before she could stop it. That involuntary physical response that she resented immediately. She was not going to sit in this cell and react to every sound like a woman who had forgotten herself. She breathed deliberately and waited. It was not Cassien. It was a dungeon guard she did not recognize, a young one, barely old enough to shave properly, carrying a wooden tray with bread and a cup of water. He slid it through the small gap at the base of the cell door without looking at her, which told her the staff had been given instructions about how to handle her. Look away, do not engage, do not humanize. She looked at the bread for a long moment. Then she ate it, because she was not going to add hunger to the list of things working against her. As she ate, she thought about what Cassien had looked like in the moment before the corridor door had opened and shut him down. That fraction of a second, where he had been about to say something real. She had seen people manage themselves in court her entire life, and she knew the difference between a person choosing silence and a person being forced into it. Cassien had not chosen silence. He had been interrupted by fear, not of her, not of the situation exactly, of something specific, something he was protecting or being protected from, and the fact that he did not trust her enough to tell her yet sat in her chest like a splinter, small and precise and impossible to ignore. But he had come back. After walking away in front of the entire court, with every eye on him and his reputation and his loyalty on full display, he had come back to a dungeon in the middle of the night to stand outside her cell and tell her he believed her. That was not nothing. She set down the empty cup and leaned her head back against the wall, and allowed herself, just briefly, just in the absolute privacy of her own mind, to acknowledge what she had never acknowledged in 22 years of careful, disciplined, politically conscious living. She trusted Cassien Thibaudeau in a way that frightened her. Not because she believed trust was foolish. Her mother had taught her that trust, placed correctly, was the most powerful resource a person could hold. But because she could feel, with a clarity that required no analysis, that whatever was between them had quietly become something she could not afford to lose. And someone in the house of Norrevane appeared to know that. Which meant she was not just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting for something far more exposed and far more dangerous than that. Dawn was beginning to gray the edges of the high dungeon window above her head. Somewhere in the castle a door opened. Then another. The sounds of mourning beginning to move through stone walls and corridors. The inquiry was coming. And Séraphine Auclaire, daughter of a king who had already decided against her, framed for a crime assembled with terrifying precision, sitting in a dungeon with bruised wrists and yesterday's ruined gown, lifted her chin toward the graying light and began quietly and thoroughly to plan. The inquiry was not held in the Great Hall. Séraphine had expected the Great Hall. It was where formal proceedings of consequence took place, where the high ceiling and the rows of watching nobles gave power its proper theater. Instead, she was brought, still in yesterday's ruined gown, still bound at the wrists, to a smaller room she knew well. The king's private council chamber. Oval table, high-backed chairs, the Norrevane crest carved into the stone above the fireplace. A room designed for decisions that were never meant to be witnessed by too many eyes. That told her something important before anyone in it spoke a single word. This was not a proceeding meant to find the truth. This was a proceeding meant to confirm a conclusion that had already been reached. The difference was significant, and she catalogued it immediately, storing it alongside everything else she had assembled through the long gray hours of the night. There were 6 people in the room when she was brought in. Her father sat at the head of the table. He looked older this morning, or perhaps she was simply seeing him more clearly than she ever had before. The king's physician, Lord Hartwell, sat to his left with a folder of documents arranged before him, with the particular neatness of a man who wanted to appear thorough. Beside Hartwell sat Lady Orinthia Pellerin, the king's chief counsel, a woman of 50 with silver hair and eyes the color of still water, who had always made Séraphine feel she was being read like a document being assessed for inconsistencies. 2 members of the king's guard stood near the door, and at the far end of the table, seated slightly apart from the others in a way that could have been accidental, but was not, was Cassien. He did not look at her when she entered. She did not look at him either, or rather she looked at him in the way she had perfected over years of court life. A glance so brief and so immediately redirected that it registered as nothing to anyone watching. But in that fraction of a second she absorbed everything. The set of his shoulders, the stillness of his hands on the table, the fact that he was here at all, which was either a threat or a lifeline, and she did not yet know which. Lady Orinthia opened the proceeding with the brisk efficiency of someone who considered ceremony a form of waste. The evidence was laid out: the vial, the cloth with the embroidery seal, the testimonies of the 2 handmaidens, read aloud from prepared documents in a flat official voice that somehow made the words feel more damning than if they had been shouted. The physician confirmed again the substance matched what had been found in the king's wine. He was careful to note that the king had not consumed enough to cause permanent harm, that he had been fortunate, that someone had perhaps been interrupted before the full measure could take effect. Séraphine listened to all of it and kept her face entirely still. When Orinthia finished, the room looked at the king. The king looked at Séraphine. "You may speak," he said. It was the first time he had addressed her since the accusation. His voice was the same as always, measured, authoritative. The voice of a man accustomed to being the final word in every room. But she heard something underneath it that she had never heard from him before. Not guilt. Her father was not a man who did guilt in any recognizable form. It was something closer to discomfort. The particular discomfort of a person who has made a decision they are not entirely at peace with, but has decided to be at peace with anyway. "I did not poison you," she said. She kept her voice level and direct, because this room would interpret emotion as evidence of instability, and she refused to give it that. The evidence against me was placed. Every element of it, the vial, the seal, the witnesses, required access to my chambers, knowledge of my movements, and skill precise enough to replicate my personal embroidery work. I would ask the council to consider who in this court possesses all 3 of those things. It is not a short list, but it is a specific one: silence. Orinthia's expression did not change. Hartwell shuffled his documents. Her father's jaw tightened by a fraction. And then a voice came from the far end of the table. "She is correct." Every head turned. Cassien had not moved. He was still in the same position, hands flat on the table, his expression carrying that military neutrality she knew he used when he needed to say something that required the protection of apparent calm. But he had spoken, and the weight of who he was in that room meant the words landed differently than they would have from anyone else. "The embroidery seal," he said. "I examined the cloth this morning before this proceeding. The stitching pattern is consistent with Her Highness's work in the general style, but inconsistent in 3 specific details that someone familiar with her needlework would recognize immediately." He paused. "I am familiar with her needlework. The cloth is a copy. A skilled one, but a copy." The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the one before it. Séraphine felt something move through her chest that she did not allow to reach her face. He had examined the evidence. In the hours between walking away and returning to the dungeon, and the long gray passage of the night, Cassien Thibaudeau had gone to wherever that cloth was being held, and he had looked at it, closely enough, and with enough knowledge of her to find what no one else had thought to look for. He had done that. Her father was looking at Cassien with an expression she could not fully read. "You are certain of this?" "I am certain enough to ask that the inquiry be expanded rather than concluded," Cassien said. "If the seal is forged, the other evidence warrants re-examination. To proceed to judgment on evidence that may have been constructed would be a significant risk to the integrity of this council and to the crown." It was perfectly done. He had not said her father was wrong. He had not accused anyone. He had simply placed the possibility of institutional error in the room and let every person in it calculate what that meant for them individually, because that was how this court worked, and Cassien had spent enough years inside it to know exactly which lever to press. Orinthia looked at the king. The king looked at the evidence folder. Then he looked at Séraphine with an expression that was moving, slowly, and with what appeared to be considerable resistance, towards something more complicated than the decision he had arrived with. The inquiry will be suspended pending further examination, he said finally. The princess will remain in custody. It was not freedom. It was not exoneration, but it was a crack in the wall. Séraphine was returned to the dungeon. She had been back in the cell for perhaps an hour when she heard the footsteps she had already learned to distinguish from every other sound in that corridor. She did not stand. She was sitting with her back against the wall, her knees drawn up, her bound wrists resting on them, and she stayed exactly as she was when Cassien appeared at the bars, because she wanted him to see her clearly and without performance. He looked at her for a moment. Then he crouched down so they were level, his forearms resting on his knees, close enough that she could speak quietly without the words carrying. "Thank you," she said. "Don't." His voice was low and tight in a way that had nothing to do with the volume. "I should have looked at it last night. I should have gone directly there instead of." He stopped. "Instead of coming here," she finished. He didn't answer. Which was an answer? Cassien. She said his name the way she had said it through the bars the night before, not as a title or a summons but as itself, just his name, and she watched what it did to him, that slight contraction around his eyes. "What do they have on you?" His jaw worked. He looked down the corridor. When he looked back at her, something had shifted in his expression. Not the opening she had been hoping for. Something more careful than that, more afraid. "There is a name," he said quietly. "Someone inside this court who has been collecting information for a long time. About me, about you. About things that would be damaging if they became public." He paused. "I received communication before the inquiry. If I spoke in your defense today, that information would be released." Séraphine stared at him. "And you spoke anyway." He said nothing. She felt the full weight of what that meant settle over her, like something physical. He had known the cost before he opened his mouth at that table. He had calculated it and spoken anyway, and was now sitting outside her cell looking like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and was still in the air, not yet certain what the ground was going to feel like. "What information?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw it again. That thing that had been living between them for years, pressing now against his control with a force that the night's events had clearly made considerably harder to manage. "Information," he said carefully, "about how I feel about you." The corridor was very quiet. Séraphine did not move. She did not look away. She let the words exist in the air, between them exactly as he had placed them, because they deserved that, and because something in her chest was doing something she had no immediate intention of, examining in front of him. Then from somewhere above them in the castle, a bell began to ring. Cassien was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the sword at his hip, his entire body shifting into the soldier before she had fully registered the sound. "What is that?" she said. His face had gone the particular blank of a man receiving information he does not want. "That," he said, "is the alarm for the king's chambers." He looked at her through the bars, and in his eyes was a question neither of them wanted to ask aloud. If Séraphine had been locked in this dungeon all night, then whoever had actually tried to poison the king had just tried again. Cassien was gone before the bell finished its third ring. Séraphine heard his boots on the stone, fast and deliberate, and then the corridor door opened and closed, and she was alone again with the sound of the alarm moving through the castle walls like something alive. She pressed herself to the bars and listened. Footsteps above her, multiple sets running, voices she could not make out. A door slamming somewhere distant, then another. The castle was waking into crisis, and she was standing in a cage beneath it, with her wrists bound, and nothing but her own mind for a weapon. She used it. If the king had been targeted again, tonight, while she sat visibly and undeniably imprisoned, then the frame around her had just cracked open in a way even her father's counsel could not ignore. That was useful. That was, in fact, the most useful thing that had happened since the dungeon door had first closed behind her, and she was not going to waste it by standing at the bars feeling helpless. She needed to think faster than whoever was above her was currently moving. The question was not who had tried again. The question was why tonight? Why so soon? Why take the risk of a second attempt when the first had already succeeded in removing her from the board? The answer to that was either desperation or arrogance, and in her experience those two things lived closer together than most people recognized. Someone had moved against her father with a specific goal. She had been removed as a variable, but something had gone wrong with their larger plan, something that required her father to be incapacitated before morning, before the inquiry could be expanded, before Cassien's intervention could begin to unravel what they had built. Cassien, the information, the communication he had received before the inquiry, the threat to release what he knew about his feelings for her if he spoke in her defense. He had spoken anyway, which meant either he had decided the cost was acceptable, or he had decided that whoever sent that communication had already decided to use the information regardless. Both of those conclusions led to the same place. Whoever was behind this considered Cassien a threat significant enough to neutralize before he could investigate further. She heard the corridor door again. Not Cassien's footsteps this time. Heavier. 2 sets. She moved back from the bars and stood straight, and waited with her hands clasped in front of her, because she would not be found gripping iron like a desperate woman, no matter what was coming through that door. It was 2 of the King's Guard. Senior ones, she noted, not the young men typically assigned to dungeon watch. One of them had a key. His Majesty requests your presence, the taller one said. Not unkindly, but with the careful neutrality of a man following instructions he had not been given context for. They brought her up through the back corridors, which told her they did not want her seen. Moving through the main passages, which told her the castle was not yet in a state of controlled information. She filed that away. They took the bound wrists off at the staircase, which surprised her, until she understood that her father did not want her arriving at whatever this was looking like a prisoner. Appearance still mattered to him. It probably always would. The king's outer chamber was full of people when she arrived, and then briefly less full. Because when the guard announced her name, several of the lesser attendants found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. Those who remained were Hartwell, 2 council members she recognized, and Lady Orinthia, who was standing near the window with an expression that had shifted measurably from this morning. The careful neutrality was still there, but underneath it something had bent. And Cassien, standing near the far wall with his arms at his sides, watching her enter with an attention he was making no effort to disguise, which told her the social calculation of concealment had slipped somewhere in the last hour. Her father was seated, not in his formal chair, but in the low one near the fireplace, the one she had seen him use when his back was troubling him. He looked at her when she came in, and the king's face was not the face from the council chamber this morning. Something had moved in it. She did not know yet whether to call it guilt or grief, or simply the particular expression of a man who has discovered he has been badly wrong about something and is not sure yet how to live in that. New information. There was a second attempt, he said. I know, she said. I heard the alarm. The physician's boy. He was found in the kitchen corridor with the king's evening preparation. A second preparation, not the standard one. Orinthia spoke from the window without turning. He has been taken. He is talking. Séraphine looked at her father. What is he saying? The king's jaw moved. He says he was instructed by a member of this household. Someone with access to the kitchens and to the physician's stores and to the council's schedule. He paused, and the pause was doing considerable work. He says, he was told that once I was incapacitated, the evidence against you would be finalized, and the Regency would pass to the appointed council steward until a suitable heir could be confirmed. The room was very still. Séraphine felt the shape of it assemble in her mind with a cold, clean clarity. Not just her removal had been the method, not the goal. The goal was the king. The goal had always been the king, and she had been the most efficient path to getting him isolated and discredited and out of the way. Because a king who had just imprisoned his own daughter on a poisoning charge and then been poisoned. A second time would be a king whose court would fracture along every existing fault line, whose council would panic, whose grip on the kingdom would loosen just enough. Who instructed him? She said. It was not quite a question. Another pause. And then her father looked, for the first time in her memory, like a man who did not know how to be in a room with her. Orinthia, he said. The woman at the window turned, and Séraphine looked at Lady Orinthia Pellerin, silver-haired and still-eyed and composed, with the absolute composure of someone who had been composing themselves for a very long time, and understood immediately that this was not a surprise to Orinthia. She had known this moment was a possibility. She had planned for it the way she appeared to have planned for everything, with patience and precision and a complete absence of visible feeling. "The boy is lying," Orinthia said simply. "He can be made to say anything. That is rather the nature of frightened boys." "He named you specifically," Cassien said from the far wall. His voice was very quiet. That specific quiet she had learned meant he was controlling something significant. He described 3 conversations in detail: locations, times, specific words. He described a ring you wear on your right hand that you never remove. A ring that is not standard court jewelry and that I have personally never seen documented anywhere in the household records. He paused. Because it belonged to House Valentry, a house that was dissolved for treason 14 years ago, a house that had considerable interest in destabilizing the Beaumont line. The fire in the grate was the only sound in the room for a long moment. Orinthia looked at Cassien with an expression that shifted, just slightly, from composed to something colder. "You have been busy," she said. "Since approximately the 3rd hour of the morning," he said. "Yes." Séraphine looked at him across the room and felt the full weight of what that meant. He had spent the entire night, the night between walking away from her dungeon cell and returning to it, not sleeping, not managing his own exposure, but pulling at threads. The embroidery cloth, the household records, the ring. He had been building a case in the dark while she sat below the castle counting stones, and trying to understand why he had come back. This was why he had come back. Orinthia moved then, not toward the door but toward the center of the room, and the movement had a quality that made the 2 council members step back without appearing to decide to. She was still composed. That was the most frightening thing about her, that the composure did not crack. It simply revealed itself as something other than what it had appeared to be. Not the composure of a loyal servant. The composure of a person who had been patient for a very long time, and had already made their peace with whatever came next. "You are all," she said pleasantly, "considerably more trouble than anticipated." She looked at Séraphine last, and in that look was something Séraphine had not expected. Not hatred, not fear. Something almost closer to acknowledgement. One careful woman recognizing another. "You are your mother's daughter," Orinthia said quietly. "I always thought that would make you easier to manage." Isolde was careful too. It did not save her. The room went very still in a different way. Séraphine felt the words move through her like cold water. Not did not save her from illness. The specific construction. The specific past tense applied to a specific action. "What did you do?" Séraphine said. And her voice came out quieter and more dangerous than she had intended, which was perhaps more honest than anything she had managed in the last 24 hours. Orinthia smiled. Small and precise. "Nothing that cannot be debated endlessly by people with more time than I currently have." She reached into the fold of her sleeve. Cassien crossed the room in 3 strides and had her wrist before anyone else had fully registered the movement. The thing in Orinthia's hand was small and dark-glassed, identical in shape to the vial that had started everything. And Séraphine understood in the same instant as everyone else in the room that it was not intended for the king. It was intended for Orinthia herself. Cassien held her wrist with a grip that did not hurt but absolutely did not move. And Orinthia looked up at him with the expression of someone who has just had one final option removed. And for the first time in that entire room, in that entire night, her composure showed its first true fracture, not collapse, just a line. Just the edge of something that had been held together for a very long time beginning to come apart at the seam. "Take her," the king said. The guards moved. In the reorganization of the room that followed, Séraphine found herself standing near the fireplace, and Cassien was beside her, close enough that she could feel the tension still running through him, like a current, that particular physical aliveness of someone who has just moved fast and is still returning to stillness. His hand was at his side now, but she could see it was not entirely relaxed. She turned her head slightly and looked at him, and he was already looking at her. "She said something about my mother," Séraphine said. "I know." His voice was low. "I heard it. Is there something to find?" He held her gaze for a long moment, and in his face was the answer she already knew, and the weight of what it was going to mean to find it, and something else layered underneath both of those things that had nothing to do with evidence, or inquiry, or the political machinery currently reorganizing itself around them. "Yes," he said. "I think there is." Her father was watching them from his chair. She was aware of it, that gaze, carrying something new in it, something that was going to require a conversation she was not ready to have yet. Everything was going to require something she was not ready for yet. The shape of the last 24 hours had rearranged things that could not simply be rearranged back. But Orinthia was in custody. The frame was broken. And somewhere in the history of this court was the truth about her mother, about what had been done and why and by whose hand. And Séraphine Auclaire was going to find every piece of it. She had been put in a dungeon to stop her. She was still standing. The interrogation of Lady Orinthia Pellerin took 3 hours. Séraphine was not permitted in the room for it, which she had expected and did not argue, because she was learning, or perhaps remembering, that the most effective form of patience is the kind that looks like stillness from the outside while moving very quickly on the inside. She was given a room in the east wing, a proper one with a fire and a change of clothes, and she sat near the window and watched the morning fully arrive over the Norrevane courtyard, and thought about everything Orinthia had not said as carefully as she thought about everything she had. She did not save her. 11 years. 11 years of believing her mother had simply grown quiet and then thin and then gone. The way some people go, without drama or explanation, just a slow subtraction from the world. She had built her entire understanding of loss around that particular shape of it. The randomness, the indifference of illness, the way it had simply happened to them, the way weather happens, without intention or target. And now that shape was changing. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window and let herself feel the full weight of what changing it meant. Not just grief, though grief was there, sitting heavy and patient at the back of everything. It was the reconfiguration. It was the work of going back through 11 years of memory and understanding that certain things she had attributed to fate had been decisions. Someone's decisions. Made in this court, in these corridors, by hands that had continued moving through this world long after her mother had stopped. The door opened. Cassien came in without knocking, which under any other circumstance she might have noted, but which now simply registered as him, the specific texture of his presence. The way the room rearranged, itself slightly around wherever he placed himself. He looked like a man who had not slept in a very long time and had decided to be functional anyway through sheer structural stubbornness. He sat in the chair across from her without preamble. "She has confirmed it," he said. Séraphine looked at him. She did not say anything. She needed him to keep going without interruption, because she was not sure what her voice would do if she used it yet. "Your mother did not die of a failure of the heart. She died of a preparation similar to the one used against your father, administered over the course of that winter in small enough doses to present as illness." He paused, and she could see the weight of delivering this information sitting on him, the particular heaviness of someone who has known a thing for hours and has been carrying it alone. Orinthia arranged it. House Valentry's interests at that time required the removal of your mother specifically, because Isolde had discovered the connection between Orinthia and the dissolved house and had begun compiling evidence. She was removed before she could act on it. The fire in the grate, the courtyard outside, her own breathing, which was steady, which she was making steady, which was costing her something she would calculate later when she was alone. "My mother knew," Séraphine said. "Yes, she knew, and she was trying to stop it, and they killed her for it." "Yes." She stood up. Not because she had somewhere to go, but because her body required movement. Some physical expression of what was happening inside her chest, which was not quite grief and not quite rage, but something that contained both of them, and something else underneath. Something that felt like her mother standing very close to her and handing her something important. She had spent 11 years thinking her mother had simply been taken. Her mother had been fighting. She walked to the fireplace and stood with her hands on the mantel and breathed and let that understanding move through her completely. Not managing it, not filing it away for later, just letting it be as large as it actually was. Behind her she heard Cassien stand. She heard him cross the room. And then he was beside her, not touching, not speaking, just present in that way he had always been present. Close enough to matter, careful enough not to presume. "There is more," he said quietly. She turned her head to look at him. "The evidence your mother was compiling. Orinthia believed she destroyed it. She did not." He reached into his jacket and produced a small folded document, aged at the edges, the paper soft with time. "Your mother gave it to someone she trusted before she became too ill to act on it herself. It was held, waiting." Séraphine looked at the document, then at him. "Who held it?" she said. "My father," Cassien said. "He was a territorial officer at that time. Your mother reached him through a back channel. He kept it, and when he died he left it to me with instructions I did not fully understand until last night." He paused. "I have had this for 4 years, Séraphine. I did not know what it meant. I did not know the connection to your mother until I pulled the household records this morning and found Orinthia's name in a place it should not have been. 4 years. She looked at the document in his hand and then at his face, and understood that this was part of what he had been carrying. Not just what he felt for her, but this weight of something inherited, that he had not known how to place or use or bring to her. And the combination of the two things had been sitting in him for years like stones in a coat he could not take off. She took the document from him. It was her mother's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere, that precise, deliberate script, the specific way Isolde Auclaire formed her letters, like each one had been considered before it was committed to the page. She did not read the full contents then. She held it and felt it and looked at her mother's hand moving across old paper and allowed herself, finally, what she had not allowed herself in the dungeon, or the council chamber, or the hours of the long cold night. She pressed her lips together and felt her eyes fill and did not look away from the document. Cassien did not say anything. He did not offer comfort in any of the forms that would have felt hollow. He simply stayed where he was, close enough that when she reached out without fully deciding to, and gripped the fabric of his sleeve, he was there. They stayed like that for a moment that had no political dimension whatsoever, which was perhaps the most extraordinary thing that had happened in a night full of extraordinary things. Then she let go. She folded the document carefully and held it at her side and turned back to the room with the clear eyes of someone who has moved through something rather than around it. What happens to Orinthia, she said. The king is deciding. The Velentry connection will require careful handling. There are implications for the treaties of 14 years ago, for several noble houses that may have had knowing or unknowing ties. He paused. It will not be simple. It never is. She looked at him directly, and the information, the threat they made to you before the inquiry. His jaw tightened slightly. It no longer has the leverage it had. The source of it was Orinthia's network. With that network exposed, the threat loses its architecture. That is not what I asked. He looked at her steadily. The fire moved in the grate between them. No, he said, it is not. She waited. Cassien had spent, by her calculation, approximately 14 years being careful in her presence. Careful with his words, careful with his attention, careful with the particular thing he carried for her that had apparently been visible enough to be used as a weapon against him by someone who trafficked in vulnerabilities. She watched him now come to the edge of that carefulness, and she did not help him, and she did not hurry him, because this was his to do, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. I have been in love with you, he said, for a considerable amount of time. Long enough that it has become architectural. Long enough that I stopped thinking of it as a feeling, and started thinking of it as simply a fact about the world. The way the north wall of the castle faces a particular direction, and has always faced that direction. She looked at him. I did not say anything because you are the king's daughter, and I was a ward with a military career, and the politics of it were impossible, and then the politics continued to be impossible in new ways. Every year, and I became very skilled at being near you without acting on any of it. Very skilled, she agreed. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape that comes before one. You are not going to make this easy. I spent last night in a dungeon. I have just learned my mother was murdered. I am holding 14 years of evidence in my hand. I think I have earned the right to make exactly one thing difficult today. He looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging for years and had never been able to fully name, and could now name precisely because it was no longer behind glass, no longer managed and filed and kept at a careful distance. Séraphine, he said. I know, she said. I have known for a long time. You are not as contained as you believe yourself to be. Apparently not. She crossed the distance between them, which was not very much distance at all, and looked up at him and said quietly and without any of the armor she had been wearing for the last 24 hours. I am not the king's daughter right now. I am just myself. And myself has also known for a considerable amount of time. He reached up and touched her face with the careful deliberateness of a man who has imagined a moment. So many times he needs to be certain. It is actually happening. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. She felt it like something unlocking. Your father is going to have opinions, he said. My father imprisoned me on false evidence. He can manage his opinions. The court will talk. The court always talks. I have never cared as much about that as everyone seems to expect me to. He almost smiled. I know. I have always known that about you. When he kissed her, it was not the desperate collision of people who have been kept apart too long. It was quieter than that, and more certain, the specific quality of something that has been true for a long time finally being spoken aloud, like the first word of a sentence that had been forming for years. Outside the window, the Norrevane courtyard was full of mourning. Somewhere in the castle, her father was making decisions. Orinthia Pellerin was in custody, and somewhere in the document pressed against her side was Husner's handwriting, her mother's evidence. Her mother's long-delayed victory over the people who had decided she was too dangerous to let live. Séraphine Auclaire had been put in a dungeon to stop her from becoming what she was. She had become it anyway. Her mother, she thought, would have appreciated that. The king asked to see her alone that afternoon. Séraphine had known it was coming. She had felt it in the way her father had watched her across the outer chamber that morning. That particular gaze of a man reorganizing himself around new information. And she had given herself the hours between then and now to decide how she intended to enter that room. Not what she would say. She had learned from her mother and from 2 decades of watching power operate at close range that preparing specific words was less useful than preparing the quality of presence you intended to bring. Words could be surprised out of you. Presence was something you carried in before you opened the door. She entered the king's private study without being announced, because she was done waiting to be admitted to rooms in her own home. Her father was standing at the window. He turned when she came in, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the width of the room, which was not a very large room, which made the distance feel more honest than it might have. In the great hall or the council chamber, there was nowhere here to use architecture as a substitute for conversation. "Sit down," he said. "I would rather stand." A pause. He accepted it with a slight nod that cost him something. She could see it cost him something. "I was wrong," he said. Not quickly and not easily. The words had the weight of something that had been examined before being spoken. The evidence was presented to me in a way that was designed to be conclusive. I allowed it to be conclusive. I did not. He stopped, pressed his mouth together briefly. "I did not ask the questions I should have asked before I let them put iron on your wrists." Séraphine looked at him steadily. "No, you did not. I am telling you I was wrong. I heard you." She let a moment pass. "I am not going to tell you it is all right, because it is not all right, and I think you know that, and I think pretending otherwise would be a disservice to both of us." He looked at her with an expression she had rarely seen on him, not the king's face. Something older than that. Something that lived underneath the office and the title, and all the years of managing everything from behind a composed and authoritative surface. It looked, she realized with a start, a little like her own face when she forgot to manage herself. "You are so like her," he said quietly. She felt the words in her sternum. "I know." She would have been. He stopped again, looked at the window. "She would have been very proud of you, these last 2 days. The way you." He did not finish the sentence, but she understood what lived in the unfinished space of it. "She tried to stop Orinthia," Séraphine said. "Years ago. She found the Velentry connection, and she compiled evidence, and she tried to bring it forward, and they killed her for it." Her father's face did something she had never seen it do. It did not collapse. He was too disciplined for that, but it came close. It came genuinely close. "I know," he said. "Orinthia has confirmed it. All of it." He turned fully from the window then, and looked at her with an expression that had abandoned every layer of political management, and was simply Raleigh, a father standing in front of his daughter with the full knowledge of what his blindness had cost. "I did not know, Séraphine. I need you to understand that I did not know." "I believe you," she said, and she did. That was the complicated thing about it, that she believed him, and that believing him did not make any of it smaller or simpler or easier to hold. "But you trusted her more than you trusted me. Yesterday morning in that council chamber, you had already decided. You looked at me and you had already decided." The silence that followed was the most honest silence she had ever shared with her father. "Yes," he said. "I did. And I cannot. There is no way to," he exhaled. "I failed you, in the way that a father fails a child. Not as a king, though I failed there too, but as your father. And I do not know how to make that right. I am not sure it can be made right. But I am asking you to tell me if there is a way to begin." Séraphine looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her mother standing in a library with a 9-year-old girl, and explaining how power moved. She thought about a woman, growing quietly thinner over one winter, fighting something alone that she should never have had to fight alone. She thought about a folded document held for 11 years, by a man who had understood its weight, even when he could not understand its full meaning, passed to a son who had carried it without knowing why until the night it mattered most. She thought about what her mother would say if she were in this room. Isolde Auclaire had not been a woman who wasted energy on bitterness. She had been a woman who understood that the past was a document to be read and learned from, not a room to live in. She had taught her daughter that the most powerful thing a careful person could do was decide what to do next. Begin by telling the court the full truth, Séraphine said. Not a managed version. Not a version that protects the crown's image or minimizes what happened. The full truth, including your role in it, including what you chose to believe and what you chose not to question. Her father held her gaze without flinching. That will be difficult, yes. It will, do it anyway. Another pause. Then he nodded once, with the particular quality of a decision that has been made and will be kept. And Thibaudeau, he said. The shift in subject was careful but not subtle. Séraphine met his eyes. What about him? He spoke in your defense at considerable personal risk. He spent the night building evidence that cleared you. He is clearly. Her father paused with the delicacy of a man navigating terrain he is not entirely certain of. His regard for you is not a recent development. No, she agreed. It is not. He is Lord Commander of the Western Forces. His position in this court is considerable, she said. His character is beyond question. His loyalty to this kingdom has been demonstrated repeatedly at personal cost. He is by any reasonable measure exactly the kind of man this court should be grateful to have. She paused. If you are about to tell me that his origins as a ward create an obstacle, I would ask you to finish that sentence carefully, given that we are having this conversation in a room where your chief counsel has just been arrested for murdering my mother. Her father looked at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time in her memory, King Aldrich Beaumont of the House of Norrevane did something she had never once seen him do in 22 years. He laughed, not loudly, not with any particular joy, but genuinely, the way a man laughs when he has been precisely and justifiably outmaneuvered and has the self-awareness to recognize it. No, he said, I was not going to say that. He shook his head slightly. I was going to say that he has my respect, and that whatever arrangement the two of you have arrived at or are arriving at, it has my blessing. For what that is currently worth. She held his gaze. It is worth something, she said quietly. It is not worth what it was 2 days ago, but it is worth something. That is where we begin. She left her father at his window and walked back through the castle corridors with the document inside her dress, close to her ribs, her mother's handwriting pressed against her heartbeat. The castle felt different than it had yesterday. Not safe. She was not naive enough to call it safe. The Velentry connection would unfold into things they could not yet fully anticipate, and there were people in this court who had benefited from Orinthia's network in ways that would take months to map. But different, the specific difference of a place that has had a lie removed from its foundations, and is now, unsteadily but genuinely, beginning to stand on something real. She found Cassien in the east corridor. He was leaning against the stone wall in a posture of elaborate casualness that she recognized as his version of waiting for her. He straightened when he saw her coming and looked at her face with the focused attention of someone reading a document they have been anxious about. How did it go? He said. He apologized. Did you accept it? I accepted the beginning of it. She stopped in front of him. He also gave us his blessing. Unprompted, more or less, something moved across Cassien's face. Not surprise exactly. Something quieter. The specific expression of a person receiving something they had told themselves not to want and had wanted anyway. I see, he said. You are terrible at accepting good news, she told him. I have had limited practice. She looked at him in the corridor light. This man she had been watching from carefully maintained distance for most of her adult life, and felt the particular clarity that comes after something enormous has moved through you and left you standing on the other side of it. Not unchanged. She was not unchanged. She was carrying things that would need to be carried for a long time, the truth about her mother, the reconfiguration of 11 years, the full knowledge of what this court was capable of, therefore what it would require of her going forward. None of that was light. None of that was finished. But she was standing. And he was here, standing with her, which was not a small thing. I need to go back to the library, she said. My mother's document names sources and contacts, and there are threads in it that need to be followed before anyone who is still in this court realizes they are about to be found. She paused. I would like help. From someone who spent last night demonstrating that he can pull a conspiracy apart in the dark with no sleep and considerable personal risk. Cassien looked at her steadily. You are asking me to help you investigate a 14-year-old murder conspiracy, with political implications that extend across 3 noble houses and possibly 2 dissolved treaties. Yes, tonight. The threads will not hold indefinitely. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you know, this is going to take considerably longer than tonight. I know. And you are comfortable with that. I am asking you to help me. I would not ask if I were not comfortable with the duration. He held her gaze and she held his, and between them was everything that had been building for years, and everything that had broken open in the last 48 hours, and everything that was only now beginning, which was more than most people got, and which both of them knew it. The library, he said. The library, she confirmed. They walked together through the east corridor toward the great library of Norrevane, where her mother's handwriting waited in a folded document, and where the truth of 14 years was about to be read in full for the first time. The castle moved around them, servants and guards, and the ordinary machinery of a court reorganizing itself after a crisis, and she felt Cassien's hand find hers in the space between them, quiet and certain. Not a gesture for anyone watching, but simply a fact between the two of them. She held it. Outside, the Norrevane grounds stretched wide beneath an afternoon sky that had cleared after the morning's gray, the kind of sky that appears after difficult weather and makes no promises but offers, for a moment, uncomplicated light. She could see it through the corridor windows as they walked. That light moving across the stone floors in long, pale bars, and she thought about her mother in a library with a small girl, teaching her to read the shape of power, teaching her to be careful, teaching her by example that a woman who knew things was a woman worth silencing. They had not silenced her. They had tried, and they had failed, because they had not understood that the things Isolde Auclaire knew had not died with her. They had been folded into a document and carried by a faithful man and passed to a son with careful eyes, and held, patiently, until a daughter who had inherited her mother's particular quality, attention, was ready to use them. Séraphine Auclaire walked into the library with Cassien's hand in hers, and her mother's work pressed close to her heart and began at last to finish what Isolde had started. Ha!